to his computer and then share the text. This is Derrida, I believe. I hope. And there's your man, Hippolyte, is mentioned here. Yep. So there's your Hippolyte. But this is later in chapter 7. I'll take you to earlier in the beginning. By the time we get to chapter 7, and this is, I don't know what session we're in now. I think we're in our ninth, but we're just starting this session. But the chapter 7 is 20 pages long. And I tried to read the first few paragraphs and I just couldn't get past it, speaking to that issue of difficulty. And one of the things that it triggered is that we have this, hey, Alex, um, spectral problem for Paul, for those of us that may be familiar and like looked at the kind of whole arc of 40 years of works and whatever, how people might want to divide up the periods of thought in Derrida, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, just to do it chronologically. That we're tempted to always constantly bring in what we know about later termed motifs and themes and concepts and signifiers and try to see them, the germs of them in this text, where, that's one approach, of course, or it's just something else. And so it's really, that's why I think it's so fascinating. But the reason we're juxtaposing it with the Be in Time section 6 on the destruction of the history of ontology is Heidegger, for his part, early on when we get to that, it is announcing all these things that show up in Division 2, temporality and historicality, for example, but he doesn't get into it. So it's really bizarre that, you're given all these loaded things right in the beginning and you don't get the explication of what he's talking about. So his risk is that then we attribute these simple senses of being in history and linear time and chronological historical time and epochal shifts to Heidegger when the Division 2 is just going to destroy all those things. So similarly here, I think what brings the two sections together at this moment, this 7 and also uh, section 6, is that, as you'll see, you can't start with the present living subject in history, watching the news, being bombarded with all these horrific things happening in the world. No thanks to the United States and what they're doing because of its leader. Um, and not feel like you're, even if it's inauthentic historicity occurring, history occurring in time, even if it's that, whether we like it or not, it's going to get recorded and probably looked back upon. Both thinkers are trying to do away with that, and that's awesome. That's the Nietzschean spirit about the uses and abuses of history. But I think, and yet somehow they're getting into something deeper than if you're going to dismiss that living subject. Well, there's still some kind of, as he'll say here, community and a virtuality. I'm just going to read these first few paragraphs, chapter 7, which is about 20 pages long. So we can't do all of it. And we definitely need to go back to that section 6 of Being in Time to pick up on the historicality problem. What the heck is Geschichtlichkeit versus Historie, Geschichte, Historicität, Geschick Destiny, Schicksal Fate. In English, we run out of things to say. History, historicity, historical. That's pretty much it. Historiology is the German way, Michael, as you know. We would say historiography, the history of historical interpretations of something. Talk about the annals or different generations of historians that may approach World War II and the Nazis one way, and then they do it. It's the myth of the figure to the structural analysis to something else. Same with the French Revolution, what have you. So we're not doing any of that. It's not historiology of the history of historical interpretations of something. But it is a transcendental and phenomenological problem of reducing the term for Derrida historicité, for Heidegger Geschehen, historizing, according to Macquarie Robinson, Geschichtlichkeit, historicality. So long story short, we're not talking about history lived in the present or the historian doing their work about the past. So a decisive step, I can bring that back because I can't see it here for you, but here's the Derrida text. Chapter 7. Decisive step remains to be taken. By itself, the speaking subject in the strict sense of the term, is incapable of absolutely grounding the ideal objectivity of sense. It looks like a Kantian limit on the capacity of reason to solve problems or to get to the thing itself. It seems like that, but let's see. He's obviously talking about Husserl. Oral communication, the later Derrida, talking about the critique of speech, but also in 1967, Speech and Phenomenon, of course, of grammatology, writing a difference, but the critique of presence and the living subject and speech and the hierarchy over writing. And oral communication, present, immediate, synchronic communication among the proto-geometers is not sufficient to give ideal objectivities. They're continuing to be endurance and persisting factual existence. Heidegger's Ständigkeit, self-constancy, persistence, duration, Beweglichkeit, movement, movedness, not the metaphysics of the subject in time, but the enduring, the Weiling, Gewaltigkeit. I'm just bracketing that. Here we also have this problem of how something continues beyond its originators, but also Derrida's contemporary critique right now of the living present and speaking subjects, which is what his generation was doing. You don't want to naively sit here and say, well, whatever the ancients were back then, those proto-geometers, they were kind of like us, just sitting around talking and like, oh, they worked together and boom, they got their insight and started to codify their principles, and that's how it all came about. Now we're dismissing that. That's not how we're going to go about talking about the so-called origin, which is being deconstructed. Thanks to which they perdure even during periods in which the inventor and his fellows are no longer awake to such an exchange, even more universally, no longer alive. To be absolutely ideal, whatever that means, the object must still be freed of every tie with an actual present subjectivity in general. Again, don't start with your present. Don't give presence to a past present, like history, and have it come alive. And yet somehow there's a transmission and perdurance. What the heck is that machinery of that archive? What's that spectral force? It must perdure even when no one has actualized it in evidence. Speech has freed the object of individual subjectivity, but leaves it bound to its beginning in the synchrony of an exchange within the institutive community. That's very complex and ambiguous. Take the object away from the individual subject. It's floating out there. It's going to have to stick, because that's what mathematical truths are. They're not subject to relativistic interpretation of different solutions or results. It is what it is for them, not for philosophers. And then the naivete is to leave it bound to some kind of historical beginning. So in other words, the problem is being historical means you can't just naively separate your present from some kind of origin and then impute to that the beginning of how you got to where you are, so you can think about how that thing began. It's not a circular problem, but there is a synchronous exchange within the community. I think what he's saying is that for him and Husserl, how does this kind of communication even come about? So what has to persist factually in order for some discussion about this fundamental ideal truth in mathematics to even come? That's that first sense is what they're both obsessed with. And the paradox is that they can't impute what comes after that first sense, how we're formed as such, to go back behind the back, so to speak, to say how the thing came about that allows us to be so committed to the subjectivities that we have, in which we can discuss the proof, for example, or the theorems, and get excited about them and get our brains operating to see how they work, like we're picking apart a machine. And what they're saying is that this is happening. What he's saying is that this is happening with thought itself. It's the possibility of writing. So this looks like what will become very soon the later Derrida, this focus on writing, later meaning in the 60s. The possibility of writing will assure the absolute traditionalization of the object, its absolute ideal objectivity, the purity of its relation to a universal transcendental subjectivity. That's pretty cool. Instead of metaphysics, subject, presence, the hierarchy we get in grammatology, Aristotle says thought represents the mental image, writing as a representation of the representation, it's derivative, it's inferior. get back to that first pure thought. Oh, we can speak about it. Then only writing comes around to talk about that relationship in an inferior sense, in a dead sense, in a decayed sense. He's going to destroy that, as we know, Derrida. But here he's just putting this value here. Is it the writing? What is the materiality of that? Writing will do this by emancipating sense from its actually present evidence for a real subject and from its present circulation within a determined community. The phenomenological encounter with the text, the material embodiment of the set of the text is freed. Is that what's going on here? From real living subjects talking about something. The decisive function of an expression which documents, is that it makes communication possible without immediate address. It is, so to speak, communication become virtual. Wow, 1962, using that term virtual. The virtuality, moreover, is an ambiguous value. It simultaneously makes passivity, forgetfulness, and all the phenomena of crisis possible. Inscribed in the beginning here, this proto sense, is a crisis. So the later Husserl, which is where the appendix of the origin of geometry sets the crisis of the European sciences, but somehow at the ambiguous value. So passivity, forgetfulness, crisis, forgetting how things began, not forgetting how things began, but forgetting that things began, but also didn't begin in the way we think they did. Far from having to fall again into real history, which is what the historians do, a truth that we have gained from this history, scriptural spatio-temporality, whose originality we will soon need to determine. That's his ambition. He thinks he's going to get to that. Look at this. Sanctions and completes the existence of pure transcendental historicity. So, as you'll see in Heidegger, it's not about the historical present. Trying to write about the past so it makes sense for us in the present and helps us with our interests in the present. It's not the past-present relationship. That's his destruction of linear time. All the Poiers and paradoxes in Aristotle having two parts of no longer, no longer now, not yet now, be a part of the thing that exists, and now the limit of something, but the beginning and ending of something. All of Aristotle's paradoxes. That's where the early Heidegger got one of his major motivations that launches his little project. But, we're not scriptural spatio-temporality. The Institute of Community. Are we tethered to those ghosts that were floating around there in terms of this genetical phenomenology of how first geometers came about? What's the regress? What made them possible to be the first to then go about trying to institute the idea of a first? to wax some Derridean here. So transcendental historicity and complete sanctions and completes. I mean, there's a lot there. And from what I understand, from what I know, Michael and Paul, others you can tell me, I haven't seen this kind of approach even in Lyotard's very early work on phenomenology and historicity. Ricoeur's History and Truth, which is a different project, is obviously earlier, also involving phenomenology and deconstructing the historical project. But for sure, I don't see this speech writing critique. I don't see whether Derrida knows this or not, the Heideggerian idea of critiquing the metaphysics of presence, speaking subjects being present, and really trying to reduce and bracket what both thinkers, Heidegger and Derrida, are going to mean by transcendental historicity. This is not a term that Heidegger uses. He's going to use Geschehen, historizing, as the English Macquarie Robinson, and Geschichtlichkeit, historicality, neither of which is being historical, historicity as an adjective, and historiology or historiography, the history of history itself, or the history of historical thinking, writing, being in history. Without the ultimate objectification that writing permits, all language would as yet remain captive of de facto and actual intentionality of a speaking subject or a community of speaking subjects. That's funny. Basically saying, don't leave it up to human beings and how they think and talk in a community. Is that the structural critique? How do you get to that objective, absolute, you know, instantiation of something? Only through writing? Absolutely virtualizing dialogue, writing creates a kind of autonomous transcendental field from which every present subject can be absent. That's definitely foreshadowing later Derrida. You don't need a subject to reading a text or writing a text or authorial intent, or attributing meaning to things, and even being present as the reader, trying to make the writer come alive, trying to talk to that writer, even though they're not there. All those problems that come up later. But, there is something, this autonomous transcendental field that, according to Derrida, Husserl didn't pick up on. He's saying this. And then here's our person, Hippolyte. The general signification of the epoche. Hippolyte invokes the possibility of a subjectless transcendental field, one in which the conditions of subjectivity would appear and where the subject would be constituted starting from a transcendental field. I'm going to stop here because it's actually before he gets to Fink. But writing as the place of an absolutely permanent ideal objectivity, and therefore of absolute objectivity, certainly constitutes such a transcendental field. And likewise, to be sure, transcendental subjectivity can be fully announced and appear on the basis of this field or its possibility. Thus, the subjectless transcendental field is one of the conditions of transcendental subjectivity. That doesn't seem possible for Kant, to have this subjectless transcendental field, if we think Kant is about that. I mean, Kant may be more complicated for these post-structures. If it's Lyotard on Kant, Deleuze on Kant, Derrida himself on Kant. But the Kant that we might think of in our Anglo-American structure is this, that would be impossible. The a priori conditions for subjectivity are the transcendental concepts that we have, presumably as human beings, not animals or cups, to receive the manifold and the mediating representation of the concepts through the schematism, which is time as an a priori determination that links our representations together so we can know something about anything. So it is experiential, and yet we can't escape these limitations to get to that thing itself. That's a crude reduction, but the point is that we're presumably he's talking about the capacity for reason and how it operates from a transcendental perspective, and yet from within. Here, there's something else, and I think that's great that he's bringing in Hippolyte. Paul, I don't know if what would be an amazing juxtaposition is Derrida here with what Hippolyte's doing with Hegel in the genesis and structure of the phenomenology of spirit. 1947.
What's the footnote there, 91?
What's that?
What's the reference in the footnote to your
Oh, yeah, let's look at that one. Which followed the lecture. Oh, it's a comment
Right.
by Hippolyte during the discussion, which followed the lecture. Father.
That's typical Derrida, isn't it? He has a footnote referencing a footnote.
Not only that, that wouldn't pass muster. Like, hey, someone said this in the alley while they're smoking a cigarette in the
It's
conference.
marginalia, isn't it? It's margins of philosophy, right from the beginning.
But you
Yeah,
know what? To his credit, look how meticulous he is.
yeah.
What's he doing?
Mm,
He's
yeah,
not falling
yeah,
asleep in that lecture. He's like, hey, police said that. And I
yeah,
wrote it down and I'm going to use that as a
yeah,
reference.
yeah, yeah.
So,
In science, they call that a case report. So if you have, so in research science, you have to do massive, you know, you have to have massive numbers of cases and massive numbers of data, but they still get to tell anecdotes. And the language
right,
for an anecdote in the scientific community is a case report.
sure,
So
Mm.
this is not unique to uh, postmodernism. Um,
right.
the use of however you want to call it, water cooler discussions, gossip, all that kind of stuff.
Honestly, you
It's
can bring in these great,
it's done everywhere.
this great
Anecdotal
tradition of
evidence.
the French philosophy of science.
Yeah.
Where they talk about the episteme, that's where Foucault gets it's Kangian and Bachelard. The way they're talking about the scientific spirit is more than we have Kuhn, of course, on our span for those of us who are familiar for this side, but on their side, it's like that's the animating spirit as you're talking about. Um,
But certainly for me, Raj, thinking about the sort of path of thought in Hegel and, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the movement of history, how those are all mutually implicated with one another in the progress towards absolute spirit is very helpful in understanding how Derrida untangles all of this from 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 Husserl. Um,
right.
and
Well,
and
he
so
doesn't, but he's not doing a direct, at least here. He'll do that a little later in mid 60s, the Heidegger Hegel work. He's not directly he's evoking Hippolyte because Hippolyte's teaching all these guys, the Hegel at the time, Deleuze and Foucault, all of them. I think was like the dissertation supporter of Derrida, as was Canguilhem.
yeah,
But for your part, what you just mentioned, because what's happening in absolute knowing, according to Hippolyte, which is different from Koja on desire and recognition and death and negation, is not is I wouldn't say he completely departs from orthodox Hegelianism about thesis against thesis, but he's talking about a double movement of how spirit knowing itself and therefore achieving self-consciousness of itself, not consciousness of a self or subject, but a substance has to intuitively, in an inwardizing motion, and also raise itself to a new level. That's what's happening in absolute knowing. The entire history of metaphysics, which is incomplete, hence the dialectical method that critiques how everybody else got it wrong. Ancient Greeks, skepticism, Stoicism, the Enlightenment, all the structures. Art, oh, that's pretty good. Religion, especially Christianity, they seem to have it. God of spirit, triune, three equals one. But it's a felt thing. There has to be a transfiguration between the present intuition of that dead resurrection and the Aufheben of that, which is a future parapsychological overcoming of everything. But that's all religion. Those guys are weak. Now the science has to absolutely conceptualize this as the notion. But yeah, it is at least Hippolyte is the pre-post structuralist, proto post. He's bringing to Hegel an extremely complicated idea of time and spirit and their unification against the history of all time-eternity distinctions, in which you don't just land back on a subject raised to some absolute knowledge. That's a simplistic kind of view, or whatever the system is, but this relationship, as you're talking about, between the subject and substance in the movement of history. So we're curious as to how much he's getting out of Hippolyte, who really does center temporality too. He brings it back because that's what's happening in absolute knowing. It's the unity of time and thought. Time is the fate and destiny. That's where Heidegger collapses. It's the last quote of the penultimate section before he gives up. Spirit is the temporalizing of temporality. Oh, great. Thanks, Heidegger. You're going to now take Hegel's concept and link it to what you're trying to do, but then critique it. So
yeah.
let's
Certainly
go
to
ahead.
me, it is the mechanics of the analysis here are Hegelian in the sense of Hippolyte, where it is a post-structuralist Hegel.
Exactly.
It's not so that to me explains how Derrida makes decisions as he's reading. And this is like one line from page 164 that he's pulling this off. How Derrida makes decisions. Okay, here's what Husserl says. What are the implications of that? And the decisions he's making for articulating those possible decisions to me are better explained by a Hegelian process than any other.
Well, it's this three H's as Descombe. It's a Descombe in French philosophy 1980 says. It's Husserl, Heidegger, and Hegel. They're all coming in at different times. And
Yeah,
to be honest, for the first time, like Hegel wasn't exactly talked about. He's in the Anglo-American, British, and American context, maybe earlier. But for the French, for whatever reason. And same with Heidegger. How much being in time did they actually get until a more complete translation?
yeah,
But Husserl, for sure, earlier generations, those three, in contrast as to Deleuze's diabolical trinity of Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. They're also hanging around. Babel must be somewhere coming in. But for sure, this is a phenomenological proto-post-structuralist rendition of Hegel, not to use a bunch of jargon. I think we can end with this paragraph because we have to go back to section 6 and you're going to see this bizarre 1927 Heidegger floating around in a similar set of concerns, issues of not wanting to be within time and locate history within that or have it flow. It's not the Hegelian problem of synthesizing this in some absolute shape against all contradictions about those distinctions between time and history, nature and history, space and time, subject and substance, movement and epochs. That's all happening. So that's why I think it's so strange that chapter 7 and then back to 6, even though we're not planning any of this, talk about the virtual community. They're in kind of conversation here. But let's see what he says in this last paragraph that gets us to this objectivity's historicity before he talks about Fink. But all this can be said only on the basis of an intentional, sounds like phenomenology analysis, which retains from writing nothing but writing's pure relation to consciousness. That sounds Hegelian, but it's about writing, which grounds it as such and not its factuality. So we're not talking about the factual empirical nature of it, which left to itself is totally without signification. So this part, the factuality, is without signification. But writing's pure relation to consciousness in a phenomenological reduction. For this absence of subjectivity from the transcendental field, named as writing, not I guess I don't want to put words here, but let's assume he's again not talking about physical writing like right now, because that's a living subject present to itself in its consciousness. I'm writing something or reading physical present text. Let's just give it its due ambiguity. This absence of subjectivity from the transcendental field. Because once you get rid of all that subjectivity, maybe you can get to something like the postulate frees absolute objectivity can only be a factual absence, even if removed for all time the totality of actual subjects. A factual absence frees absolute objectivity, the transcendental field, writing. The originality of the field of writing, its ability to dispense with, due to its sense, every present reading in general. Not literary critics or philosophers or artists, anyone in the humanities. We interpret, we do all kinds of things, and there's no landing on a single truth. But you don't want to play around with subjects and their biases when it comes to something as important as the validity of scientific truth. The standard model in physics, right now there's still predictable and consensus around the solidity of Einstein's general relativity until somebody else comes along and does something, blows that up, like he did to Newton. So you don't want to mess around when it comes to using subjects with all their limitations. But if the text does not announce its own pure dependence on a writer or reader in general, if there's no purely juridical possibility of it being intelligible, like a language should be for a transcendental subject in general, then there's no more the vacuity of its soul than a chaotic literalness or the sensible opacity of a defunct designation, a designation deprived of its transcendental function. So you can't have unintelligibility nonsense, which Merleau-Ponty can understand too. The limits of it, what is the threshold from sense to nonsense, the early Foucault to madness. So that's the aporia. So you don't want the living subjects in this transcendental field. On the other hand, you can't announce it's pure on a writer-reader for it to have some kind of signification process, I guess. The silence of a prehistoric arcana and buried civilizations, the entombment of lost intentions and guarded secrets, and the illegibility of the lapidary inscription disclose a transcendental sense of death as what unites these things to the absolute privilege of intentionality and the very instance of its essential juridical failure. I don't want to read the French. Heidegger, when he's done with being towards death, which is not physically dying, there's a spectral quality, as you'll see in that. You don't live past the transition. Dasein is being towards death, pure possibility to be. And it's not the physical death that I'm going to have for myself or when I see a dead relative who just recently died. So that's the Heideggerian breakthrough for the Heideggerians. But here, this conception of death and the virtuality and the instituted community and the spectral nature of it. So what is going to be that kind of phenomenological reduction of the encounter with the prehistoric? So we don't impute ourselves into it, see ourselves in it, but we can also shake who we are in an uncanny sense, that monstrosity that decenters us in our closure, but not end its grammatology with regard to this problem of historicity, being historical and not temporalizing in any simple sense. So,
Is
yeah,
a quick question on the language here, and my French is not good enough to track this, but Paul, do you know, is the translator putting essential juridical failure? That's the translation of sans échec?
No, that's yeah, it's strange, isn't it? It's not
In
quite
which
exactly the same.
the unit absolute of the
right intention through the same
intentional
instance
law
of the
of its being crossed out.
I
That
I think maybe they glossed it as juridical failure because échec has some kind of legal sense in French, but I'd have to check that in the literary dictionary. But échec is cognate with the English check, as in checkmate. So it has that idea about it as well, as
oh
sort of
really
game over. Uh, but I think it probably has some legal sense, which is why they glossed it as
so
juridical
they go
failure.
juridical there. Yeah.
well the unit instance absolute right law because right and law
I can check it
intentional
out.
instead of intentional essential and the instance there's the instance of the same
I mean, it's
then
classic Derrida, right? Its juridical essence is based on its lack of juridical essence. In other words, if we
Well,
want to
but
go,
being
well
on record of appearances, the record of judgment, you're going into a court, there is the same sense there that there is a weight of judgment, there is a
yeah,
forestalling of judgment, but there is a process to move through judgment.
which is rooted in a failure, Alex. That's what he's
Yes,
what's essential here is the failure of the thing that makes it
incomplete
so
process.
solid.
yeah.
It's incomplete, it's contingent, it's arbitrary, and you have to fix once it's stuck, you're stuck.
Yeah.
So, but it's sort of like a simulation.
Yeah, this is an
Well,
amazing
this is too
paragraph.
hard. I want to stop here because if we're going to get into graphic body, flesh, spiritual corporeality, geistige Lebendigkeit, localization,
I'm just
temporalization, and
I'm
think.
just looking at the literary definitions of échec, and
Uh,
they don't mention a legal sense, but they do mention a military sense of a sort of
Same thing.
turnaround or a reversal in the battle. That seems to be the original meaning of it. From there, we get the chess term.
Thank you.
It's certainly not an everyday word, and it's not a legal term, apparently, as far as I can tell.
The whole piece began with that epoche, which is the suspension, bracketing, reduction. It's the hardest thing when you deal with Husserl because people think intention is I intend to keep a promise to my friend that I'll meet them tomorrow or something. So it's not in human intentionality of the mind and how we intend things and stick to them in commitments or Befindlichkeit or or mood or orientation towards something, but it's the bracketing and suspending at the same time, which is hard to understand of what our consciousness is compelled towards, hence the problem of protensions and intentions, the temporalization of our consciousness towards anything, including ourselves, in the moment of thinking about either thinking or thinking about something, but it's that I don't want to assume anything empirically about that thing. I'll do it if I have to look at a dog. I'll have to then bring up the concepts and the ideas and whatnot. Say, oh, yeah, that's a dog. That's a brown dog or a white one, or that's a Doberman Pinscher versus a poodle. No, it's the encounter with an enactment sense of what exactly is happening in the relationality between the activation source and whatever I'm going to think and have about or have consciousness about. And the two poles are not some subject-object relationality in a simple sense, positivistic sense, psychologistic sense. So the epoche is about that suspension. And that's very hard because you got to keep going back to the activation of that first sense that says, okay, I'm not going to say anything specific empirical about that thing yet. I'm going to talk about my encounter and the relationship between um, what is there, being there, which reveals itself in its essence, and how it draws me in. So he's talking about this whole transcendental sense of depth that unites these things to an average absolute privilege of intentionality. In the very instance of essential juridical failure. Okay, I got to talk about bracketing, intentional animation, and I would draw to the next sense. Let's stop there if that's okay and come to section 6, and to catch some folks up back where we left up. This, that, here. And if I may ask, for those, just I think right now, all I see is Michael, Paul, and Alex. Have you read Division 2 of Being in Time recently? Particularly this. You have, Michael?
Per your suggestion, I blew through sections 70 to like 78 yesterday.
You blew through that
very quickly.
So what happened to section 6 to section 70? All of Division 1 and basically the first
I've read
4 chapters of Division 2.
Yeah, that's
so you did do it. Okay.
Of Heidegger's section 6. I did. Yeah, I read that. And I went on to section which is, man, oh man, are we far from the shallows now? But yeah, so I did section 6 and 7.
Okay. Well, yeah, 78 takes you up to the beginning of chapter 6 on its timeness. 65 is excess. So 72 is where chapter 5 begins, temporality and historicality. And that's what's mentioned here. But, Derrida has a problem with, obviously, the phenomenological, transcendental historicity, phenomenological reduction, the first encounter. Don't be naive about how both language and speech and writing and subject formation takes place, the institute and community, the production of scientific knowledge, and anything that claims to have any truth value. Not because he's a relativist, but it's just that's what's so amazing about how breathtaking or crazy a radical phenomenological approach can be, because it wants to reduce everything to that first instance and show the failure beneath it to try to get a hold of that. There's no a priori unified presence. Maybe that's the Kantian legacy, the thing in itself. But we do have this manifold that we're drawn to. We're trying to make sense of it. So here, there's also a discussion of failure or concealment. Geschichtlichkeit, if you start at the top here, if this historicality remains hidden from Dasein, whose being is rooted in this. And, not to foreshadow section 74 and 75, which you mentioned, Michael, it's that section on the moment of vision. I'm so tempted just to introduce the famous paragraph from Free for Its Death, Authentic Fate, the repetition of handing down to oneself, but also actively freely choosing, because you're not encrusted in your historical present. You have a relationship responsibility towards that past. It's going to be passed down. You're not just going to make up some other history with the West, in quotes, because people are deconstructing that now. The Greeks, did all the geniuses of ancient Greece, started everything. So that's what's passed down, and yet it's still over determining how you want to think about things, and Heidegger wants to be free from that, so we can be responsible for ourselves in an authentic way, but you have to choose to receive that, and yet something is going to occur with that. So that historicality is authentic fate, but not fatalism or determinism, because it's ultimately about an individual freedom or decision. As he says in that section, in communication with a generation. So when people talk about De Vogue and the destiny of his time, yeah, they want to bring in a political question. But philosophically, at that moment, he's not referring to a generation that he lives with, but it's really this radical individual choice that is also not the individual subject, Derrida saying. It's a radical singularity of the choice or decision. So Dasein in chapter 4 of division 1 will have these 4 or 5 components to what the Dasein is, one of which includes the they, that means others, oneself, that doesn't mean the individual subject, or just being alone. Mit Dasein with other Daseins, probably heading towards their own authentic possibilities, and finding them and being there with them, whether they're present or not, as he says. And then with being in the world, there's a with quality always. When you're in the world, you're not just Robinson Crusoe. So those all go into the equiprimordial structures of Dasein, but here it's all rooted in this historicality. So we're not going to turn historians into history, especially empirical history, but this is not evidence against Dasein's historicality. On the contrary, as a deficient mode of the state of being, it is evidence for it only because it is historical. Can an error be unhistoriological? So I'm not going to turn to just any historical interpretation. I don't want to be told how to interpret the present. I don't know about you guys, but I almost find it unbearable to be in the historical present if you know what we're living through. In the U.S., for example, you're not in the U.S. Well, Michael and Alex, we are. I don't know how you guys do it, but I'd rather just like vanish into another time period or just not even exist. That's not suicidal. It's like literally no longer being there.
I'm a very depressing presence at dinner parties. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
Because
because it's like,
go down.
If not to go down these, there's got to be a limited amount of air left when I put the helium bag on, and you're supposed to go at some point. Yeah. And yet, somehow someone's filling it up with more madness, which is literally what's happening. So, what is this deficiency of falling back into? We already looked at that footnote too. The verb for felon is one in which Heidegger will use many times. Though we shall translate simply as fall, it has the connotation of deteriorating, collapsing, and falling down. Like erosion in the sand, a building whose foundations are weak, it's about to collapse. Is it the, what's that called? Structure detonation? Conspiracy theorists on 9/11? Neither are fall back upon, nor fall, if they're admitting is false prey, which they'll say later about this falling down or deterioration, is quite right. Fall upon, fall onto, the building's collapsing and you fall onto some rubble, which is going to hurt. We fall upon to it, which more literally for zu befallen, falls to the lot of, devolves upon, would do well with the felt, with the dative in their other context. They don't like to so well here. Falls to the lot of. Well, we can have a lot of interpretation what that means. It's the fates attributed. Only a portion of people have to suffer this way. Devolves upon. Let's keep reading here. On the other hand, if Dasein is seized upon its latent possibility, sorry, that was footnote 1. I already went to footnote 2, which we'll come back to, so it's not irrelevant. But the footnote 1, deficienter modus. Heidegger likes to think of certain characteristics occurring in various ways or modes, true, like temporality, ecstasies, among which may be included certain ways of not occurring or occurring only to an inadequate extent. Being weak, like a weak light bulb, it's not fully occurring. Occurring, it's still occurring, but only to an inadequate extent. This looks interesting. It is as if 0 and the negative integers were to be thought of as representing deficient modes of being a positive integer. -1 is not 1, or -2 is not 2. It's less than or negative or a weaker version, not fully what something is, being historical. If Dasein has seized upon its latent possibility, that's going to come later on resolute resolve, action, coming back from that uncanniness. I'm not supposed to just be here and live out this life. People tell me what to do. be a teacher, be a parent, be this, be that. Something else. It's not going to go on forever. I got that uncanny feeling too, that finitude, but I can't pinpoint it in time. I'm not going to come back and live to tell, so be resurrected from from the death. Care is being towards death, and it's a way of being. It's the allotment of that time and the stretch of it. It's the movement of that I might feel, the extendedness of the soul, Augustine, but it's not the subject counting the clocks, the ticks on the clock, to talk about my existential issue. If I sit there and look at the clock all day long, waiting to see when the tick is going to come, I'm going to die. People think I'm crazy, which I would be. But so we're not talking about that type of temporality and that type of anxiety about death. So somehow there's going to be shattering yourself against death, the freedom, and the authentic fate is not the hero in the Odyssey, like the big movie that's out now. There was I'm not going to do none of that mythological stuff. Let everybody else have fun with that. Human subjects thinking, oh wow, that's the meaning of life. Hollywood telling us what philosophy is. Something else is the latent possibility not only of making its own existence transparent to itself, meaning the meaning of existentiality, you call that the Dasein analytic, to into fundamental ontology, which is the meaning of being. So far, it's been forgotten and leveled, starting with Plato's sophist, that we still don't know what the hell we're talking about when we invoke that term, not just the verb or the subject predicate or the temporalization of the present is being. But that's what we'd already talked about. Time is a horizon of understanding being. Dasein's the inquiry into being. It's got an essential structure of understanding into it. Dasein's in the world. It has care. Care is rooted in time because of this finite problem being towards death. And that's the whole book, but we never really get to that ecstatic temporality. Is time the horizon for being itself? Which is the last question of the book. But the meaning of being is not answered. If by such inquiry its eyes have been opened to its own essential historicality, why this destruction of the tradition is required, then one cannot fail to see that the inquiry into being, the ontological necessity, which we've already indicated, ontological difference, being is not beings, ontic, everything present at hand, living subjects, ready to hand tools, present at hand, other people, things, the past that we're taught in school to valorize, 1776, not 1619. Someone's pounding all that history into you saying, hey, this is what it is, and you gotta have some national pride about that. That's all ontic. One cannot fail to see that the inquiry of being is itself characterized by historicality. But again, that's so elusive, as is transcendental historicity for Derrida. The almost meaning of being, which is going to turn out to be, Dasein has to pose that question. It's built into Dasein. It has a relationship to this. The meaning is the for which, the thrownness, the anticipatory, thrownness towards, upon which you're going towards, not the indication or intentionality, a consciousness about the thing and the encounter with that in our own comportment relationship. That's Husserl. This is something else, as we all know. But it has to do with the temporalization of being finite. Going back to all those resources in the past that he gets from Aristotle or whoever, but reworked, positively making his own, as he's going to say. It belongs, the almost meaning of being, which belongs to the inquiry into being, as an historical inquiry, gives us the assignment, Anweisung, of inquiring into the history of that inquiry itself. The inquiry is an historical inquiry, but we got to inquire into the history. You see here he says, inquiring into the history of that inquiry. Look how bizarre this is. Inquiry into being is an historical inquiry. It's not a scientific one or a zoological one or oceanographic or, it's historical, but we don't know what historical is. Dilthey onwards is not going to help us with historicism or historicist debates about the bizarre temporal paradoxes of doing history. We have an assignment of inquiring into the history of this inquiry. Could that be the history of being or the history of metaphysics? That is of becoming historiological. In working out the question of being, We must heed this assignment so that by positively making the past our own, we may bring ourselves into the full possession of the ownmost possibilities of such inquiry. The question of the meaning of being must be carried through by explicating Dasein beforehand in its temporality and historicality. Thus it brings itself to the point where it understands itself as historiological. Okay, there's a lot going on here. He hasn't announced the destruction part yet. That's still coming, which we keep trying to get to. Question of being is we are to destroy the traditional content of ancient ontology until we arrive at those primordial experiences. Sorry, right here. Question of being is we are to destroy the traditional content of ancient ontology until we arrive at those primordial experiences in which we achieved our first ways of determining the nature of being, the ways which have guided our sense. It seems like he's going in a circle. We're not doing history here. We're not just trying to value our heritage. We're trying to reawaken, reactivate that primordial sense that shocked them, the wonder that they got, without assuming what all the historians in our present are telling us about how great they were and we come from this tradition, at least you guys, since you seem to descend from the West. My ancestors are from South Asia. So whoever has that identity that goes way back then in terms of having a Western identity, this is what we are. He's not talking about that. It's something far more radical. And something has to be destroyed because something has been forgotten, meaning, is it what Derrida says later on in Husserl and Brandeis and other places, that it is the distinction between being and beings, what Heidegger calls the forgetfulness of that launches the history of metaphysics by conflating being with being so we can conceptualize it. Is that difference itself traced, and is that trace erased in its own production based on something even more primordial, difference? That's Husserl and Brandeis. But don't take for granted Heidegger's solid distinction of being and beings. That's easy to say. It's been forgotten. That's why we equate being with beings. We got to undo that. We're not going to be able to get back to the difference because then we're going to have to conceptualize that difference and say being is something else versus beings, if that's what Hegel's up to. So that's the debate that's kind of going on between the three. If you allow me, instead of getting to destruction versus deconstruction, he mentions it here, explicating temporality, historicality. If we fast forward to literally chapter 5, you'll see what the title of that is. I don't want to, it'd be very careless if I brush through this, but what's happening here in this 72 has nothing to do with initially temporality, historicality. He's got done talking about being towards death, and he said he forgot about analyzing being towards birth. Is this whole analysis so far incomplete? I'm trying to go for the whole, but if I can't even see a more radical way than I've focused on being towards death and deconstructed all kind of human, psychological, anthropological, religious, theological conceptions of death to give us this more authentic possibility of the stretched nature of our time, knowing we're going to die, but not when. It's up to me to die my own death. I can't take the place of Alex's. Alex, I can push you out of the way of the moving bus. You'll survive. I'm going to be in the one that doesn't mean I take away your death. You can keep living. I'm the one that's going to go. I hope. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen. It's an example. But I forgot this being towards birth. What is this stretched finitude, stretched temporality? Not a sequence of now points, but the unity of that whole, inclusive of birth and death. Because death is a possibility, so can birth. Not my biological birth, 55 years ago from my mom. But, being towards birth, is that a movement towards something? But he hasn't gotten to historicality. Lo and behold, you jump to 74, which I'll get to in a second. Constitution of historicality. Will take you to the penultimate paragraph. Authentic historicality. Just going to read this and maybe we can pause here, open up our discussion. If Dasein, by anticipation, Dasein is not an entity in the world. It's thrown projection of possibilities. As long as it is, it's incomplete, hasn't died yet, it's no longer in the world. It's still there, but it's not something. So you have to complete it. But it's not like finishing an artwork or writing a book. It's your life, if you're talking about human beings. It's always anticipating its future in its nature, but not because tomorrow I got to go to my appointment at the DMV. Not that future, but the farthest limit of what I can imagine myself to be in the stretch that's been given to me beyond any predicate or empirical value. What the hell does that mean? Nothing ontic, promotions, more money, all the stuff that I'm being pressured to do. Raise my kids when they're very young. So you might want to attribute all those. It's an extension beyond any kind of extendedness into that type of future because it's a process of having been to repeat and come back. But it's not coming back as in the eternal repetition of what was already existing and that somehow it can't advance to the next stage because I'm always going to go back to it. It's not that paradox either. You're not going back to anything that was before you, let's just put it that way. But it is a repetition. So this being towards death, I will have been maybe, oh yeah, like how will people remember me? What's my tombstone going to say? It's not that because it's very much happening. Dasein then is free for death. Dasein understands itself in its own superior power, the power of its finite freedom, not unlimited freedom to live forever, but the Kierkegaardian anxiety or dizziness of, it sounds maddening, but once you really understand the power of being finite, you're freed from all the superficialities of external answers as to why we have to die. What does it all mean? To taking hold of that yourself, doing something crazy. It's fun to be finite because I'm going to do something with it.
Yeah, it gives Sartre and radical freedom in that moment. Like we are here, I am here because we are here together, and therefore.
And it's not the superficial Nietzschean interpretation. I'm going to say superficial interpretation of Nietzsche because it's not easy to interpret him either. But I want to live this life over and over again. That's what we mean. Groundhog Day. No, that's spatialized, ontic, pictorial representation. It's not even Hegel's memorialization of the dead man, the resurrection. I mean, the Eucharistic rememorialization of the same thing every Sunday. That's how he talks about Christianity and revealed religion. No, there's got to be something more than that. And it's not just the second coming awaiting, which a lot of crazy people are doing right now too, especially those in power, reshaping the geopolitical fate of the world. But we'll get back to the Kierkegaardian problem. The footnote is fascinating, which is only in its having chosen to make such a choice, the choice to repeat the tradition, but positively appropriate, destroy what's buried, because it's so calcified, you want to break it open and pull out what's fresh and new, potentially, not out of contrivance and fabrication, because I'm like a modern person. I always want the new thing, or the Marxian commodity fetish, but it's just more of this, you talk about responsibility, it's temporal. Take over the powerlessness of abandonment. God, I'm stuck in this historical present. It sucks. I'm being told what to do with my, here's Kant and here's Hegel and here's your first year college history of philosophy course. Take over the powerlessness of abandonment to have it done so and can thus have a clear vision for the accents of the situation that has been disclosed. So the prior section was not about connecting a bunch of experiences that we're having together right now to make sense of the historical present. We're all living through it. It sucks. You have your interpretation or affects of what's going on. I have mine. And let's come together with some narrative. And then maybe we politicize it. We take some position on the spectrum. I'm not trying to reduce what people are trying to do right now to resist and fight. But, we take a political position, for example, or we define some kind of program or platform. He's not talking about that here per se. It seems very individualistic. But as you'll see, it's not just about the individual. Derrida's Institute of Community, subjectless transcendental field. Dasein's not a human subject. It's not an individual person. So there goes this whole idea of like, oh, he's worshiping the hero, the Führer. At least if you want to save Heidegger, others will make their critiques. But a faithful Dasein as being in the world exists essentially is being with others and historizing as a co-historizing as determinate for it as destiny, Geschick. historizing Geschehen, occurrence, movement of the whole stretch occurring. So you can encounter both the historical, do something different, not be the slave to it, not be doomed to repeat it. And don't just think of the future as just blindly rushing into it because it's the next great thing, or like, some political program is telling us the Trump machine says, this is how we're going to be. And everything else has to be destroyed or excluded from this one narrative of how everything has to be forever. This is how we designate the historizing community of the people. Destiny is not something that puts itself together out of individual fates. It's not the summation of the parts to a whole. Any more than being with one another can be conceived as occurring together as such. Again, let's get rid of all the subjects. Derrida was talking about that too. It's not that. Guided in advance. What the heck? Greek fates? Our fates have already been guided in advance. In our being with one another in the same world and in our resoluteness for definite possibilities. Only in communicating and then struggling does the power of destiny become free. Dasein's fateful destiny, in and with its generation, goes to make up the full, authentic historizing of Dasein. Okay, so that's where a lot of people debate. Like, this is where we can get him. And he's talking about being in his generation with his people, Weimar's collapsing, and Schmittian issue of sovereign is the one who decides on the exception of the rule and needs to save us in an emergency situation. Hence the kind of like justification of authoritarianism, which is being played out today. So people can focus in on that. But let's go to this later footnote. Well, first of all, let's do both footnotes, 1 and 2, because 2 is very important about this powerlessness, abandonment, superior power, and 1 is even one who is irresolute gets driven about by these more so than one has chosen, yet he can have no fate. So sorry, I didn't give us that prior paragraph. Let's just do that real quick and it can make sense of the footnote. Dasein can be reached by the blows of its fate only because in the depths of its being, Dasein is fate. Okay, here we go. An authentic fate. Fate is authentic historicality, as you'll see later. So they're all kind of interchangeable right now. Repetition, heritage, transmission, choosing, historicality. Here he's saying Dasein is fate, existing faithfully in its resoluteness, which hands itself down. I'm going to do something because I don't want to be told what to do with regard to my history of philosophy. Not because I want to become some novel thinker that's remembered, but because something is compelling me and I owe something back to that heritage, which has been, in a way, destroyed or forgotten, but to destroy the forgetfulness, not because I want to remember something that I can discover as true as the instituting origin and say, hey, yeah, that's how it all began. In a totalitarian sense, we all have to obey that. But something else, like I'm going to fate myself to and sacrifice everything so I can really come back to what it is, which has been forgotten. Dasein has been disclosed as being in the world both for fortunate circumstances which come its way and for the cruelty of accidents. Fate does not arise from the clashing together of events and circumstances. That's what happens in our life. Like that convergence, we're like, oh wow, it's really bad right now. We're living through a bad time. Our AC broke, I think, a couple months ago. It took 17 attempts to fix a $10,000 investment in the middle of a Massachusetts summer. Michael, I'm laughing. Alex, you know, you're in Philadelphia. It's been very hot with the 2-year-old, the 4-year-old. That's terrible. Like, why did that happen when we could have literally gone through them? So, or a convergence of good interests. Like somehow we survived that payment of the 9,000 because my partner just got a new job, which is going to increase his salary after having tried multiple attempts in other areas. That also literally came right around the corner. Oh, we planned that, or we knew that was coming. And so it's not just the vicissitude, as he says. Something else is going on. Let's see what he says here. This statement may well puzzle the reader. You've been chosen, but you have no fate. So fate is something else. This statement may puzzle the English reader, who would perhaps be less troubled if he were to read that the irresolute me can have no destiny. So you're not resolved to do anything. You just float around like a pinball machine through the accidents, somehow survive, bungle your way through, keep your head above water, and you just live out the thing. So that's not having a fate. But fate also is not like what we think is fated to us from some predetermination, the pre-existent logos. Zeus playing around up there with mortal lives and circumstances unfolding the way they do. As we shall see in the next paragraph, Heidegger has chosen to differentiate sharply between Schicksal and Geschick. You see which are ordinarily synonyms. Fate and destiny. Schicksal, our fate, might be described as the destiny of a resolute individual. Destiny seems so grandiose. Fate makes it more individual, especially the resolute individual. Destiny, you can't have a destiny for an individual. That seems like that's for a larger group. Dasein a member of the group. But again, this is not how Dasein's talked about in Division 1. It's not about an individual subject interacting with other subjects. We develop a community and we agree to certain things and do things. Dasein already has that day structure in itself, which is totally inauthentic because we're always listening to everything in our head about others and getting caught up in things and falling into curiosity and gossiping and whatnot. So even if we're alone, we're constantly bombarded. And inversely, being the ascetic monk in the monastery, totally alone, really, and physically can be, is completely full of stuff happening with them in a huge community of things going on. That's the phenomenological issue. So Heidegger is already overturning individual versus community and self versus society. He's not talking about any of those. So Geschick is probably to be distinguished from that which we have met. What we prefer to translate by vicissitude, the things that kind of come along and the life changes, and some are you can plan for, some are unplanned, and you're just floating along in the stream and bumping along, and you just kind of deal with it. The etymological connection between Schicksal and Geschick on the one hand, and Geschickte, history, also history with an IE, history, story, Geschickte, history sounds like professional history, or professional historiography. Geschehen, historizing, which unfortunately becomes historicity in the Stambaugh translation, and for most English speakers, we don't have historizing, we have historicity, historical quality of the thing happening, the value of the historicity, the temporal kind of like scintillation that takes place with an artifact. We get excited when we find a tome where the brother of James, his name is listed as the brother of Jesus, and sitting there in the first century AD, and we discovered it. Oh wow, that gives credence to. Is that the historicity, or no? Not, because that's still, for Heidegger and Derrida, for obvious reasons, that's still kind of very empirical and ontic, and reinstantiates the dogma that made us, and we're out for the freedom, the Kierkegaardian freedom, in our finitude, not moral finitude, of being this slave to this epoch in history that's told this is what you're about. This is explored in the next paragraph, of course, is lost in the translation. So, okay, they're telling us don't go with individual versus group. So there you go. And you're not going to deal with the simple idea of fate with the individual and destiny with the group. This is where it gets very interesting. Go back to 2. This whole line here. Superior power. What the heck is that? Finite freedom. Is being present, understanding of being, time as a horizon. The primordial temporality, which you just got done discussing, coming towards your having been. Coming up towards your greatest possibility to be. Anticipating that, but not in terms of idiotic content. You are your having beenness, not because you're dragging your past along with you, but you're always in the process of having been. You're already it, and yet you're futural in that regard because you're going to do something different with it. Maybe you're always trying to escape from the present because you're a slave to what's determined you this far. And at any given moment, I can escape from everything that's determined me. Could be that. A lot of debates about the ecstatic temporality. But anyway, they have a unity. It's the primordial interrelationship between those ecstasies, future having been present, making present that allows something to be cleared in the light that it is to show up for what it should really mean against anything that just says, hey, it's right now, this is what's happening. That was, tomorrow will be this. There's ecstatic unity occurring. As he says, you're ultimately in your temporal sojourn outside of yourself and coming towards yourself in the world. But you're outside of yourself insofar as at any given moment, you can activate that sense of uncanniness. Why am I here? What am I doing? What else can I be against any kind of simplistic sense of being in time right now? And this is what this moment means for me. He's trying to go against that. So, what is the disclosure of the vision? This is really bizarre before you get to the ultimate paragraph here. Look at this one. And I've looked at this in great detail. Wenn das Dasein verlaufen den Tod in sich mächtig werden lässt, versteht es sich frei für ihn in der eigenen Übermacht seiner ähnlichen Feinheit, unendlich, infinite, Freiheit, freedom, in dieser nur ist im Gewalthaben der Wahl die Ohnmacht, think without powerlessness, der Überlesenheit an es selbst zu übernehmen und für diese Fälle der erschlossenen Situation ersichtig zu werden. Okay, that's a lot to pack into this. There is no, or the second, sorry. Yeah, exactly the second. Thank you, Mark. It's not all of it. Well, wait a minute. We'll come to it. Let's see what the, yeah, right, exactly. But the Verlaufen is the anticipation. Needless to say, the superior power will show up, powerlessness of abandonment and vision. Those are the three that the translators are going to focus on. But I'll go with you.
But they call it a trance. They say trance-like expectation. That's like he's waiting for ecstasis.
Watch this. It should perhaps be pointed out that Ohnmacht can also mean, so this is the powerlessness up here. Can take over the powerlessness of abandonment. Faint or swoon. Remember that falling down business, deteriorating? Faint or swoon. That's so interesting. I mean, Corey Robinson. Okay, so we have the Ohnmacht with the powerlessness here. Take over the powerlessness of our faint. Most people who faint or swoon, there's nothing they can do. They're dehydrated, or they're a heat stroke, or or some got some really bad news and then they pass out. Swooning also more than that, obviously romantic connotations that can get into the erotic or love, but we'll bracket all that. But the Hellsichtigkeit is a regular term for clairvoyance. A German reader might easily read into this passage a suggestion of a seer's mystical trance. Well, Heidegger is not going to get into the theological. He's already dismissed that. My friend, a colleague, was saying, according to him, the greatest rupture in Heidegger's life was having to leave the Jesuit order because of his heart problem. He never recovered from that. And of course, he always went back to the monastery when he wanted to escape from everything. After denazification, he couldn't stand himself. He wanted to kill himself. And his father, his real father, Grover, the priest that helped him out in the beginning, rehabilitated him, so didn't kill himself. So there's some constant dependence upon the religious. I'm not trying to make light of these massively complicated issues, but I'm just saying that they are saying you could see in these terms here that Hellsichtigkeit is the term clairvoyance, which would be vision for accidents of the situation. Making sense of all the crazy things that's happening in your life. You don't want to put them all together in some narrative that explains it all. You're not going to float along and just accept it. You got to do something. But what does that mean when it comes to thinking? So, pre-existent logos, Jesus before his death. Before his arrest. The guys are sleeping, stay awake. Can't you guys stay awake for an hour? He's talking to the father. I don't want to do this. It's going to hurt. Oh, if it's your will be done. If it's possible, first let this death escape me. Oh no, I got to do it. Okay, if it's your will, to be done, then it shall be done. Help me from this hour, the sweat and blood. He prayed so much, he was bleeding. His sweat was like blood. Foreshadowing, anticipation. Something's going on. He's got his own ecstatic structure going on. Heidegger's not talking about that. It's awesome. It's an awesome scene because he's not talking to any human beings. He's talking there's a relationship going on there that's, anticipation of what's to come, death in its own superior power, free for the death. I'm adding all those Christian registers. I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but just by contrast. We got to get back to the philosophical component. Maybe we'll close out we'll have our discussion here and see what people think. Because here's another definition. We have that powerlessness of the Ohnmacht, the fainting or swooning, and then we have the clairvoyance for the Hellsichtigkeit, the vision for the accidents. Clear vision, that which all the scholars want to know. What does he mean by that? Like the moment of vision, blink of the eye. Powerless, you'd think, because if you're fated, you can't be self-determining and just do whatever you want. Most of us can't. I don't think any of us can, including Elon Musk. He thinks he can, but he can't. But then it's a superior power because against all the superficial acceptances of either the vicissitudes or thinking this is what I mean and this is what I'm going to do because I'm doing it right now in the present and whatever I'm now, that's what I'm supposed to be and that's great and I love being me. No, that's not the anticipatory resoluteness of the greatest possibility to be, which is going to turn out to be death, but death is not just dying physically. It's not living to tell either, near-death experience or faith, Christian resurrection. Let other people have that. So it's got to be something else, which is the kind of open-endedness of your time and sojourn, because you can't map it to spatial structures of a beginning and end, as if you're living just in between, as he says earlier in the chapter, which puts itself in readiness for adversities. Oh, fascinating. This is going to get us back to conscience. Power projecting upon oneself, one's own being guilty. Not being guilty because I committed a crime, but because of the very fact that I exist is a Lutheran saturation in sin. It's unbearable. Only grace can save me, not works. But don't think that any kind of Catholic confession and sacrament is going to help you overcome that, foundational structural level of just the sin of existing. Not Calvin's predestination. Some are chosen, some are going to be damned, as Weber says. But being guilty itself is not just because it's not just I want to be guilty. Or the flesh, the sin of the flesh existence. It's choosing to have a conscience, which is not a moral code of what's right or wrong, or because you're psychologically activated to feel bad about something, but doing that for your whole stretch of life. Like, hey, I'm not just going to do this. The gift of being born, for a lot of people, it sucks because their lives are miserable. Freddie Mercury, better to not been born, Bohemian Rhapsody. So let's just do away with those ontic registers here. Because it's of doing so reticently, which is very important in that section. It's through the silence of not telling people anything about yourself. Not because you're paranoid or you're solitary or you're, agoraphobic or something. It's just there's power in the silence to just say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not going to disclose anything about myself, even to myself, but I got the calling to be able to respond to the thing that I want to be able to take account for, which is this entire life, paradoxically as I'm living it. But I can't draw from all those kind of bombardment of experiences that are happening because I'm transcending that too. That's the time question. And anxiety, as you know, is not just I'm anxious about fleeing towards death. Fleeing from death because I don't want to think about it, get lost. If I'm getting older, young people don't really feel it unless they're told that they're sick, for example. But for most of us, mid-age, like, oh, wow, okay, like I'm running out of time here. In a way, you got to do away with all those psychological registers. Fate requires the ontological condition for its possibility, the state of being of care. Care, chapter 6, division 1, comes from that myth. Earth makes the body, somebody gives it a spirit. This is not a Christian story, this is one of the Greek myths. And Saturn is supposed to be time, that's the Roman iteration of it. Let's get a stretch of life. Cure, care. Okay, well, who's gonna, after the body dies, who's gonna get what? Well, you get the body, or it's buried, you can go to heaven and do something. That stretch of life in between, that's gonna be care's job. So that's what he's talking about. Temporality, but not linear time. Primordial. In and for itself, outside of itself. Occurring. The movement of it. Is it the accumulation as you get older? No. Is it the Hegelian problem of the Geist culminating history? Simply put, no. But it's not with a simple beginning or end. It's definitely not just living in the present and living things out. But it's about that getting a hold of something. Death, guilt, conscience, freedom, and finitude. For the analytic Michael, that's not good to just list a bunch of things and not talk about their relationships, because he doesn't give us the relationships here. He just lumps them all together. Equiprimordially in the being of an entity, as they do in care, only that can exist in the mode of fate. That is to say, only then can it be historical in the very depths of its existence. The hero or the being historical, I'm going to do something I'm going to do something historical. Not because I want to become famous or take over the world, but because I have to do this to take care of something. Only an entity which in its being is essentially futural, leaving this, going out, as long as I can. Is it sacrificing everything? Because if I were to take this great risk, I could die, but I got to do it. Is it that heroic thing? No. But free from any superficial dogmatic commitment to what I'm supposed to do, because everybody else is telling me, hey, be religious, so don't worry about death. You'll get your resurrection. Or, hey, don't worry about it. You can return to the earth and join this organic whole that you began from. Or any other perspective on it. No, that's not going to do. That kind of freedom towards a powerful, superior relationship, which is getting a hold of that powerlessness, thrown back upon its factical there, that's not being present. Is it that feeling of truly transcending what you are in the moment? Because your disclosure is about your time, not the time that it is now. So think about that there as not a now present. Shattering itself against death. This can be interpreted a billion ways. Are you really alive? If you're not really alive, you're not really going to die. So maybe that, is it Eastern? Death is an illusion, Buddhism, dependent origination, transmigration of souls. How do you know death is what it is? Don't want to minimize the complexity of those traditions, but that takes us in a different direction. No. He's also not saying you're not going to face physical demise. If you see everybody else historically, except Jesus, or that no one's been resurrected. Paul, if you don't have that, the resurrection, you got nothing. So that's what that tradition had that. But so far, we don't have any proof of anyone outliving, surviving their death. So you can't mean shattering biological death. It's how you're going to relate to the end. Only an entity which is futural is equiprimordial in the process of having been, just a repetition. Handing down to itself the possibility it has inherited. For him, Western philosophy is a Western guy. He's not doing Eastern philosophy. Take over its strongness, abandonment, be in the moment of it. It's like a repetition of that first paragraph. For its time, the Zeitikon of Zeit. Temporalizing of temporality as a process, section 65. It doesn't emerge from itself. It's not anything. A lot of Heideggerians want to talk about the nothing. I don't. I want to give it the fullness, like a Hegelian conception of what that equiprimordial process of having been, equiprimordial future, can hand down to itself. And then the moment of vision. Only authentic temporality, which is at the same time finite, makes possible something like fate. That is to say, authentic historicality. Coming towards, you would think it's death. Having been, you think that's whatever I've been. But he goes to great lengths to dismiss all those registers. Coming towards is the coming, and coming up to, and coming up against, and maybe Alex, you mentioned the court going up to the judge. Could be that. And having been isn't just your biological past and, celebrating your birthday every year. And making present is not simply what's already there in the world that you encounter. Because you're talking about the whole stretch of your life. Outside of yourself, bird's eye view, kairos, Paul, you're Greek, continuous running finite time that's past, or undecided, as in it's still going on, if that's what it is. The various registers of kairos. And in Aristotle, 1922, the Aristotle book that launched Heidegger, he does say chirological as he's dealing with Aristotle, but he's got this Augustinian Christian problem of time with regard to what really is the movement of life in this kind of like post-Christian structure that Aristotle couldn't have access to. And he uses the word we usually spell it with the K, but CH from the Greek, kairos, chirological. Well, we're not talking about the fulfillment of time and the sending of the sun. What's antithetical to that? All right, so there's no way to get into this if you don't have ecstatic temporality from section 65. There's no way to get into this chapter 5 without the problem of death, which you get chapter 1 of division 2. Being towards death is the greatest possibility to be, the possibility of impossibility, of no longer being in the world. But don't use your present sense of what that's like, because otherwise you'll be dogmatic. Hey, after death, you're sitting up there in the clouds talking to a guy with a big beard, white beard. Or what anyone else tells you. It's not the near-death experience. Hey, I left this and I came back and this is what I saw, and that's what you get to look forward to. Or you meet your relatives and dead pets that you used to have, and, sit around forever. Or to quote Nietzsche, who can stand an eternity with Peter, the Peter we got in Jesus' lifetime who kept making all these ridiculous mistakes, the doubting and the bungling and this and that. So, who would want to spend an eternity with Peter? I always like saying that. Turns out Peter's a pivotal guy, so I got to give Peter his chops, if you want to have some respect for that tradition.
Who would want to spend an eternity with Nietzsche?
No. Well, it turns out nobody did, and he was alone for 10 years in the asylum, except his sister, who appropriated him and turned him into a future Nazi. So poor guy, what happened to him? Yeah. Salome obviously didn't choose him. Poor guy, that's probably sent him on a spiral. Or Regina for Kierkegaard, what happened to him? He died early too, for other reasons. But chose his philosophy and eventually what he meant is pastoral existence as a pastor in the rural parts of Denmark versus being married and having kids. So, okay, here you have it. It's almost like, at least here, you have all the components that were there prior. You have the care, you have death, you have ecstatic temporality, and now you got the authentic fate and historicality. So, I think just in conclusion, so we can just, how do we have these theses? I'd like to know, where did it go? Section 6 was up here. Sorry. We're not even remotely. Section 7 and 8. We'll round out the part 2 of the introduction and we can actually get to the book itself. We haven't even gotten to phenomenal logos. And then the whole structure of the treatise, but where do we leave off here? Section 6. Should already have this here. All right. Yeah, here we go. Terrain falling down. Oh, come on. There's 6. You already got past that. Where does he say it's grounded in temporality and historicality? All right, I'm just going to end it here because, oh yeah, here we go. The question of the meaning being must be carried through by explaining. You saw temporality and historicality sort of being entwined in that last passage. We got these weird connotations to the mystical trance and the clairvoyance. But
Clairvoyance relates to the
yeah, go ahead.
present, doesn't it? It's different from precognition. I wonder if there's something that he's saying there about how we perceive things, sort of Kantian way. It's interesting that they use the word clairvoyance to translate it.
Clairvoyance for the hell, the Ohnmacht is the powerlessness. Remember that, and the Hellsicht, or which they say swoon and swoon and fainting. But then Hellsichtig is what they say clairvoyance. But that's
what mediums do and what hysterics do. They swoon and faint, don't they?
Yeah. Clairvoyance, sixth sense, deja vu. That you can play with temporality there too, but they want to avoid that. Well, here we get if it's true that's all heading towards you, and of course we haven't even gotten to the clash with Hegel, within timeness, datability, spanning epochs. That's going to come in chapter 6. This is chapter 5, the temporality historicality. But I don't know. Do you see what do you got? Am I just making this stuff up? I go back to that Derrida in 1961, if that's what it was, or 62, Origin of Geometry. And he's obsessed with this historicity problem. He's going to name it as difference, deconstruction, the absolute ideality, which God shows up to in the very last chapter, if you recall. Then we got this. And they don't trust any simple empirical narrative of how everything started. Genesis, creation, human history. Is it too extreme to say they don't even trust human beings and human consciousness to give meaning to itself? Or is that too far for you?
How do you define
I
it?
think they're.
Go ahead.
After you, Michael.
It depends on how you define humans and human consciousness, and to what degree they're mired in, inauthentic modes of being or superstition, a la Heidegger, or an excessive attention to positivist history, a la Derrida.
But isn't it like both of them are all offering us the present tense view of getting outside of the self and the conceptions of the self and the conceptions that the self brings from the sedimentation of history around itself? Like, you're stuck in a pocket. Okay, you've got lint in your pocket. That doesn't mean anything about what's outside of the pocket. That just means you have lint in your pocket. Like, there's no actual precedental or anterior meaning for you saying you have lint in your pocket, other than the you itself saying it has lint in its pocket.
Well, how do you get
Like
the lint? How do you get the lint out? First of all, if you don't know you're in it.
I think that's his question, right? That's the remove the ontic register of the lint and the pocket, and then see yourself outside of you having a pocket which has lint in a larger pocket, which we would call what, life or the horizon, consciousness.
It's like both guys, at least in this instance, are not. They don't invoke. I don't see any trace of a human subject. Maybe that's my Derridean radicalization. Both of them, 1927, 1969. Oh, no. Heidegger is all about the human being, human existence. Anthropology. He goes to great pains at every step. Oh, yeah, you think we're talking about us. He thinks of himself, I guess, as a human being, man. But then he goes, no, don't go with any of the traditional conceptions. Something that presupposes being. We get time is a reservoir understanding being. The meaning of Dasein's being is temporality. That's it. I don't see human in there. And I don't see a circle either.
Raj, at this point in the way that Heidegger is writing, I think ultimately you're right. There's no sort of secular humanness in what Heidegger's trying to get to here. The language, though, is still pretty mixed up for my nickel. So sometimes he's speaking of us and our destiny and where we might go, and all the echoes of the Rector Ratsreda that foreshadows. But more profoundly, I think there is what uh, the French might call a structuralist attention to these modes of existence that aren't necessarily human, quote unquote. And he struggles from this point forward to try and articulate that in different ways and with different language. Here, it's still pretty mixed up for my read and my having gone through a lot of the middle and later Heidegger texts.
Well,
we're not the Lichtung, we're not at Ereignis, we're not at Es gibt, we're
the
not at all.
Gewirrt, the Gewirrt, the Weerfault, and
Yeah, the Gewirrt, the last
Mortals,
God,
Divinity, Skies, Literary Humanism too.
the,
Holy Being, Divine God. Well, okay.
but it's
you know,
all, but it's here. It's here.
He loves the word structure. That thing is showing up constantly. But he also says horizon has a temporal foundation. What the hell does that mean? Foundation's the ground, horizon up there. So structure, without the French structuralism, because that's their tradition, which is against dialectics, it's about the relations and asymmetries between different things that show up in patterns, where you can bring these opposites together in different ways, you can create new distinctions. But yeah, the structure here. Okay, well, he, not to get historical, but Karl Barth's Epistle to the Romans, and the Romans particularly, oh man, who are you to contend with God? And Nietzsche also closes the Antichrist with that, also doing a lot of Nietzsche in the background, even though he's not teaching it. Aristotle gives him the metaphysics and Nicomachean ethics about the divine nature of the philosophical life, which is pre-Christian. And Bultmann and Barth, Barth on the Romans, but Bultmann in this kind of historicity of the eschatological structure, which is not some simplistic eschatology, but the lived temporality of Christian life is lived temporality of an expectation and waiting without falling back into the superficial, meaning in the case of the second coming. So I know you have all that, and of course he's not going to commit to any of those because he seems like if it's transcendental, as in philosophy, it has to be universal. It has to have those qualities of being universal and necessary. That is, I guess, fundamental ontology would be to answer the question of the meaning of being. But this whole book is about just trying to work out the question to make it, kind of update it, so to speak, going back to the past, reworking it. And he says that as we haven't gotten to the end. Whatever appeared to the Greeks, they came up with the question. It presented itself in such a way to them. They tried to answer it in their own ways. They had the facility of their language that was conducive for it. I'm much weaker. I don't think I'm going to be able to answer this. He says it's a lot. My cognitive powers. It's not my contrivance. It's already out there. I'm just kind of taking it. But those dopes back then, what the question appeared to them in the way that it did, meaning they don't have 2,500 years afterwards like we do. So of course the question is going to be their watch, whoever put it together for them was like have that many components. Ours has this, and it's so complicated that I'm not going to be able to answer it. And he doesn't. And then we get that outline of the whole system of whatever he was going to do, and missing division 3. There's only part 1 to this, 2 divisions. There's no division 3. Part 2 is supposed to appear later from 1927 to 33. Basic Problems, the Kant book, the Leibniz book. And if you go through those, you can either go back to Kant's schematism and the relationship between anticipation, retention, the making of anything from our sensibility. You can go back to Kant's schematism, which he tries. Dives into a little bit of Leibniz. And then he comes back to the temporal sojourn. What does it mean to just occur as a stretch of life, as time itself, without knowing what that is? Hence the ontological difference. And then, I'm not saying mysteriously, back to energeia and dunamis and Aristotle's metaphysics, this problem of the activation of life. And then Hegel's phenomenology, as you know, 1931. But just the introduction, not absolute knowing. And in the very end, this is my recollection, the struggle he had at the end of this book with Hegel. He comes back to him and he goes, well, you know what? We're both coming at it, time and being, in our own ways. I'm not competing. I'm not saying I'm right, he's wrong. We're just doing it differently. But then that's what he says. This fake, not fake humility, but kind of prefatory humility, and then the big punch, which is, but that guy, being in the history of metaphysics, he wanted to come up with a concept of time or try to conceptualize being itself as time. I'm thinking about being in terms of the question of time, but keeping it open-ended. I'm not trying to spatialize it, conceptualize it, represent being as becoming or being as time, or the unity of thought and being as unity of thought and time. That's what he was up to because he's a metaphysician. I'm pointing to something other. And then it ends. Like there is no other beginning. There's no passage or understanding of what that project was about as the Western Dasein, obsessed with time, can't do anything about it, doesn't want religion because Nietzsche's crazy guys in the marketplace saying God's dead. Nobody knows what to do with anything. The West is done. It's toast. It's exhausted now. The technical modernity that we live in that enslaves us all. Or this other beginning. So we don't get this compulsion to like conceptualize time. That's how the story ends at this period before what you talked about, Michael. Can I ask where you land then? Not to put you on the spot, Michael, with the later versus this period. Does the later
Again, Raj,
do does the
that was
later
garbled.
does the later do something for you in response to this kind of abrupt ending of this period for fundamental ontology? Because it does a lot for a lot of
In the
scholars.
question of project of being in time. Yeah, I, I think it extends Heidegger's project, but it's in a different tonality. And it's a shame that he wasn't able to continue um, in this context, which is so imbued in, to me at least, in Western philosophy, that he wasn't able to continue it here. And instead, it's all, in more poetic turns of phrase and on the basis of analysis of art and of other poetry works. But I think the
Do you know
later
a lot of
Heidegger,
lot of folks would be perturbed by what you're saying?
why would they be perturbed?
Not me. I love it. But
No.
what do you mean? The postmodern, Derridean, the binary assumptions you're making, what's highly deconstructible,
Oh,
what you're
I
saying.
can't help making a binary. I can't
The
speak if I can't make
romanticism in it,
binary.
but the modernism, the romanticism, the subject, Come on, Michael, what do you have? The West,
But
your
I think as a
Eurocentrism of the West. I'm not accusing you of being
but hang on,
Eurocentric.
hang on. Derrida himself would have, and he tried, right? He decided I'll write in my own on my own project. But he himself would have carefully worked through the final chapters of Being in Time as
Of
they exist
course.
here and
Of course.
try to articulate, the implications of those in, his own way of, working through an idea,
And he
just as he
did.
does
He
the
did
origin jump.
repeatedly. He did repeatedly for 40 years,
Yeah,
up to 4 years.
yeah,
Very careful, especially on
yeah.
the death chapter.
So that I think I'm not, I don't mean to say anything other than this is worth continuing to mine. And that said, I'm probably in the read Heidegger backwards camp, where my understanding of Being in Time is strongly influenced by the middle and late Heidegger.
Oh, I see. Because I feel like, okay, because that generation's passed. The Bert Dreyfus, Caputo's old now, Sheehan's old. Of course,
Yeah.
they came. That's a generation that came after the Dreyfus and the William Richardson, and then you got this, and then you got the mid '50s now, and you got some emerging guys. My point
I
is
think it was
that
Rainer Sturman. Rainer Sturman was the mid backwards guy.
yeah.
But anyway.
Well, my point is that it doesn't have to be the backwards guy or using the late to interpret theory. Not to get into the Heidegger debates. Is you said something about the shame and this fundamental incompleteness of this, which everybody's trying to debate, of course, and that even Heidegger in his own reactions to what this is and what it means, blah blah blah, throughout. But if we just stay here, as you said with the text, and then you got to compare it to 40 years later, which is this germinal project in Derrida, which we all care about. I mean, I'm thinking this group cares about that. And the relationality on this problem of historicity and time. and that's kind of how I kind of came into all this, and I still do, is that we haven't really thought through any of these questions without some predetermination of what we mean the failure of Heidegger's fundamental ontology. What are the origins of deconstruction? What are these layers of generations that you talked about, in at least a French context? And then this missing problem of Hippolyte and Hegel, which I feel. So I think there's a conference coming up in Italy about the 100-year anniversary for Being in Time. And my hypothesis, which gets them hearing, is that it's not a question of taking sides on what Heidegger does to Hegel at the end of Being in Time. Is it possible that you can read absolute knowing, even in a Heideggerian way, against Heidegger's dismissal and critique, that the man Hegel himself is not talking about within timeness or flowing in linear time or raising that to some kind of eternal conception? It's some dialectical problem. And it's not certainly not some simple idea like Fukuyama about the end of history and it's going to result in X, Y, and Z, which people, the neo-imperialists today, want to define for us. But it is a very complicated nexus that can get us very close to what's happening in this division two at the end. To imagine the silhouette, hypothetically, Michael, as if he were to continue back in 27 without the pressure to finish and whatever you end up talking about Kant afterwards, just go back to Hegel. Before you get to that 31 saying, hey, he wanted to conceptualize time, I'm posing the question of being anew in terms of keeping the time question open. That's what makes me an authentic finite person. He doesn't say this, but having an authentic relationship to our history. Whereas that guy has this atavistic drive because he doesn't know better, that he's been pushed to think this is what he needs to solve. And he went for it, and no one has gone that big and bold as like him before or since, but that's a failed project. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm thinking, wow, well, this is the either or. And no, how about you, Heidegger, really having the opportunity and space to work through these very meticulously, as you said, questions. The beauty of what we just read about that fate, moment of vision, clairvoyance. Why there's no being towards birth. What happens to the movement question? Ontological movement of existence is not ontic motion or change of location, back to Aristotle's metaphysics, applied to this post-Christian structure of finite life. And then temporality itself. The ecstasies are never explicated in their ephemerality. So the whole thing, there are many incomplete moments. It's not just crashing on Hegel.
Yeah.
Third horizon beyond the two. And Pippin doesn't give that. He doesn't give that either. They're the idealists. Hegel's Kant. Together they can give us a rational kind of approach beyond the postmodernists. But Heidegger's a guy, I'm going to admit now. He's, he did, we can salvage it. But for what? Pragmatism? Sociality of reason? Philosophy of mind? We know how we are, and what we can do or can't do. They all begin and end with this conception of the human of some kind, which is what Heidegger told us presupposes something else. We don't know what that something else is.
I mean, Raj, it does not surprise me, given your understanding of Derrida and your own life involvement with Derrida and Derrida's understanding of Hegel in the French structuralist and post-structuralist sense, that you see, greater resources in Hegel than perhaps Heidegger allowed himself to see himself. And it's a shame to me that Heidegger didn't spend more genealogical time or phenomenological time with Hegel's texts than he did, because there's a lot there, and I think to some extent you can see it bubbling up through the preface to the origin of geometry and the the emergence of the Derrida's many projects as they come forth in that text. And clearly, it's an extraordinary tool at the very least. And I don't mean to disparage, say it's only a tool. And then Heidegger just he didn't spend as much time.
You wonder who did in this time with the
Yeah.
It's Kant and Aristotle, Plato and Aquinas, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. This is all the biography. Brentano's book on metaphysics and Aristotle being, okay, that opened it up. Leaves Aristotle behind, comes back to him mysteriously in the early 20s. And then that's the pivoting moment for him. Kant, again before, because it was very early on, and then right up, leading up to being in time, and definitely obsessed with it. But the schematism, I mean, I think, didn't we do that in one of the sessions? We looked at the schematism.
Yeah.
But we haven't looked at absolute knowing. And that's why this group hasn't even, it's talking about Derrida, and Derrida will do this. He'll try to bring in a Hegel in many different points in time and reckon with it. But I'm trying to look for him on Kla. Paul, does have his allusions to absolute knowing. But the sustained reading of absolute knowing, Kojève has about 30 pages in his famous lectures. But that crowd is about death and desire and recognition. I want to simplify the master-slave dialectic, the politics of that for Kojève, the end of history thesis debates. But, time and eternity and absolute knowing. And then Hippolyte's, 600-page commentary, taught himself German by translating the phenomenology. Also, if you want to go back to his genesis and structure of the phenomenology of spirit, and what is he saying? And then Marcuse, 1932, I mean, just fresh off of Heidegger's training, Hegel's ontology theory of historicity, but comes back to the problem of life. And as a future critical theorist, it's really about the absolute decimation of modernity, Western modernity. It's a more Nietzschean spin. But yeah, no, I think what you're saying is that every allusion to Hegel makes him a straw man, but also valorizes him, including his Habilitatio Schrift. He concludes it with the greatest and most powerful, he calls it worldview, which is kind of disparaging, ever put forth, that of the system of Hegel. So Hegel does haunt him, you're right. And the book ends with Hegel. Yeah. Literally with that last crucial piece. Time presents itself as the fate, destiny, necessity of spirit. Time is the concept which is der da ist, is there, Dasein. This is all Hegel. But Heidegger has it in his head, the dumb Western person wants to metaphysicalize this mystery. Instead of having an authentic relationship to the question, you want to conceptualize this thing. What are you gonna stop the river and say what it is? The being of becoming? Nietzsche? You invert all of metaphysics? You just inverted it. That still makes you the last metaphysician. Don't prioritize being, you want becoming. This is both sides are, whether you like being or becoming, you're both trapped. That doesn't do justice to what Hegel too.
No, it doesn't. Just to say it's just a world view, I think is maybe the, it's like, what? That's all that's Hegel is a world view? Like what? Did you wrestle with the preface to the phenomenology of spirit?
Right.
What are you talking about?
It's in the nature of truth to appear in its own time, but that remains private to the individual. I don't blame the masses for not understanding philosophical work. It's the intellectuals that want to let the dead bury they want to take you out the door before you even entered the party.
Yeah. So I think the analytic, not in the sense of analytic philosophy, but in the terms of trying to understand something, the analytic tools in Hegel are just they just, it's a gift that keeps on giving. And I think Derrida.
Hey, and the Anglo-American analytic guys know that too. The Brandeis and these Pippin and McDowell, they come back to it. But this is, again, it's not. And I know Pippin's. Somebody's doing a group, I'm sure, on this, but he's attempting to say, okay, maybe I did this criticism, and I've been the Hegel guy, but this is Heidegger was at it too, and this is why. And I don't want to simplify that. But I will tell you, I don't see schematism in Kant. I don't see the time problem in absolute knowing. And I don't see the pre-being in time and post reckoning with both in Heidegger. at the same time, and therefore all the secondary literature, as far as I can tell. And then here comes Derrida in his own germinal way, via Husserl, trying to bring in his program. No acknowledgement of Heidegger yet, but as we move forward in the origin of geometry, it's all going to be temporality again. Is it the Husserlian problem of internal time consciousness, which he acknowledges? But there's no discussion, I can tell you this right now, of ecstatic temporality and being in time.
Yeah. He has that one reference to Heidegger, doesn't he? Here in the origin somewhere, it's in a footnote somewhere. It's Husserl, blah 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 blah, and then also Heidegger. It's very.
And they was the weak translation of being in time, or at least a portion of it.
Yeah.
Was it Corban? They didn't get the full one.
I don't know, but then when he's teaching being in time, he's translating, right? So a couple years later, when
that's he himself. By the way,
yeah, he Derrida.
I'm trying to get not young. I'll try to talk about the text. I don't know which since you both read French, and I'm not sure, but you tell me if this is the one you've been working with. I have the hard copy here somewhere, but it'll come up in a second. I'll just wait for it to come up. Let's see if I can bring it up. You know, if you look at Spanish translations, Portuguese translations, it is true. You don't have this multi-layered etymology built into all these German terms. There is a Latinization and flattening. Derrida's différance,
it just is.
the différé, can recuperate the value of the Latin, but I just don't see the Zukunft with the hyphen and the Künftige, the coming part, and the Zu, and coming towards and up to, which is always a problem. Is this the one? I can tell
What are you looking for, Raj?
I'm trying to look at the date of the various existent translations in French. Is it this guy? This doesn't give us a date. When you've seen being in time in French.
I think it's quite late, if I remember rightly.
There's a new Spanish one out of Chile. That was just like 5-6 years ago. That's an updated. And then, of course, we have a new English one.
On the question of translation, which is a topic which interests me greatly,
yes.
I feel it keeps coming up and it keeps getting in the way of our discussion. And remember that the origin of geometry is an introduction. Derrida's essay on the origin of geometry is an introduction to his translation.
His own translation, right?
A minor text by Husserl, and it was his sort of first major project. So the origin of Derrida is in translation. There was something very interesting you just said. You just said that Hippolyte taught himself German by translating Hegel. And apparently we've been reading Gillian Rose in the other group, and somebody said exactly the same thing about her, that she taught herself German learning Adorno. Now, from a modern translator's point of view, that's the wrong way round. Yeah, you're supposed to know the language before you start doing the translation. And I wonder to what extent our reading of Heidegger through these various translations, which were done by academic philosophers, not by people who know the language in any depth, I wonder if it is somewhat colored and maybe distorted by the fact that these are people who taught themselves the language reading philosophy rather than learned the language and then did work on translating the philosophy.
It's entirely possible. Yeah.
The debate is that the Stambaugh translation was
very good. And Macquarie is sort of an intellectual grandfather of mine, because one of my tutors at Oxford was a student of Macquarie.
Oh, wow.
And I was a big fan of Macquarie's translation of Heidegger. But when you compare it with the original, he's putting a lot of stuff in there, a lot of theological stuff, and that is not there in the.
Well, he's a theologian.
Stambaugh translation is very close. Yeah, I mean, he was a theologian. So
he's a Boltzmann.
It's covered by that as well.
Right. Well, he struggled. They at least tell.
I've been trying to compare the two.
Yeah. Stambaugh's is considered a disaster,
And
but
they're very
although,
similar.
yeah, well, she does
They're
historicity, which is a
similar,
problem.
and she muddles up
She muddles it up.
bits and changes things for no apparent reason. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, the problem, well, this is a very
So we lack
simple,
a translation.
but the simple 5-year-old statement is that any English translator, presumably, unless they grew up bilingual or maybe grew up in Germany, and then but fluent somehow in English too, can then translate to German and English. As far as we know, these English translators grew up with English, like we all did, and at least for us three, me, Alex, and Michael, I'm assuming we grew up in the U.S., so American English. And so, how do we? You're not going to Umbesetzung, reoccupy magically, to use Bloomberg's mysterious phrase, the epoch in which you're born into the language, with that sedimentation that goes into it. If you grew up in another sedimentation, to then try to figure out the relationship between the two. But the point is that you're right, Paul. I mean, okay, so you need to have the fluency of all the possible etymological structures, and you have to have the philosophical training. But in the Anglo-American world, the first philosophers of Heidegger, let's say the Bert Dreyfus analytic side, and then the William Richardson, which is the theological side, right? A father of William Richardson.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
wouldn't busy themselves with translation, but yet what this sounds critical. Okay, I'll just say it. These two Anglo-American pillars, American pillars really, Anglo, with direct contact with Heidegger himself, both of them. Whether Heidegger believed anything could come out of English for his work, he refused to speak. And of course, he had nothing pleasant to say about America before and after the war. And certainly would not have anything nice to say about the Eastern Soviet structure. But which is Bibikin and the Russian trend. When I talk to the Russian students, Bibikin and this guy, not Dugin, the sociopathic thinker, but this Russian translation takes us into all kinds of space. It's is the demand to have that perfect fluency, Paul, and philosophical expansion. My view is that you take whatever you can in terms of the polysemic, which is a Derridean point, multiplicity of all these phrases that Robinson and Macquarie struggle with. Do something, make your choices, but the main thrust, the Urdrang, is to continue where Heidegger was going, which was your point, Michael. Where was he actually going before the whole frickin' thing collapses? And then the so-called missing division 3 is missing for a lot of reasons. Jaspers, and if it was burnt or dismissed or whatever. And then if those of you that really know your Kant and can make your way through the Kant books, there's literally no mention of basic problems, of course, has 60, 70 pages moving to, again, Aristotle, Descartes. Everyone says, oh, yeah, that's your part 2, and that's already outlined in being a time. And there you have it. But if I just recently went through that last section on temporality. Temporality, as Heidegger says, Temporalität is the German, with the big T, translation of the English temporality with the small t, which is the translation of his German Zeitlichkeit.
Yeah.
So that's the big umbrella of problems that he's going to work on. I'm going to work on temporality. But this is what I started out with, is a little temporality, which is ecstatic, that derives linear time. And he repeats all the gestures in being in time. It clarifies, it's very clear, but the examples are very compelling. He's a good teacher in that regard. There's a lecture course. And but totally inconclusive. And somehow ends up, I think, back to Kant, of course, and Plato's, I better get this right. I think it's the Phaedrus. Some kind of strange tale about Kant reading Plato saying, well, you know what? If you can't get people to understand you, so to speak, then
use stories.
then what are you supposed to do? It's just like, okay, is the sarcastic Kant. Well, the point being is that he didn't have any. I'll tell you this: there was absolutely no other breakthrough in the 1927 onwards. There's a deepening for sure, and some new directions, as you say, Michael, as before he completely goes into some different tonalities, directions. But on the time until Time and Being, that's 1962. true time
Yeah,
is
I mean,
true time is four
I'm a
dimensional.
I'm a Beitrage guy, so
Really?
yeah.
You are?
But Paul, to your note, I think, yeah, the Paul, to your conjecture, um, I mean, a commonplace is translation is just impossible right from the get go. But I think true translation, transparent translation, it just you can't do it. But to note that for philosophy and maybe for Heidegger in particular, most of the translators come from an academic philosophical perspective, I think is a good thing to keep in mind. That the window that you're reading it through is colored by that.
Hmm.
I will say on behalf of Bill Richardson, there is that note. I forget where it is, but he sent that letter to Heidegger, right,
Right.
in German, and of course probably spent 2 years writing a letter. I know at all. And Heidegger said, I forget who it was, but he's like, "What the hell? This is this American guy, and he gets me? Like what is
Yeah.
going on here? No one else, no one else.
Right. At least
Not
he did acknowledge in any other language.
yeah,
But by the way, it
nobody
was
else."
the literature people who translated Derrida. I don't want to minimize
Mm.
that debate, Paul, but it wasn't the philosophical crowd, as far as I know. David Woods
And the
I
translations are
don't know if
better.
Gachet is a philosopher or literature guy, but yeah, they're all literary folks. But for Heidegger, yeah, he did. Um, you know
So
what? You just
There's
inspired me.
recent,
Nurgler.
when
Yeah,
Do we
go ahead.
bring
what
up?
we
Well,
lose,
he installed
what we
the Heidegger
lose,
one
and I
and
keep going
two.
back to this, is the sense of when is a word being used in a very technical, idiosyncratic sense, and when is it an everyday word that has a range of connotations in everyday life, and to what extent is Heidegger referring to those connotations?
Yeah.
Now that's the question that keeps opening itself. I mean, it's why I find reading this text extremely difficult, because every word I come across, I ask myself that question.
Hmm.
Is this a neologism being used in some special technical sense, or is it drawing on a word that's used in everyday life? I mean, if so, in what sense?
Yeah.
And that brings up a huge sort of can of
But
worms.
that's what Macquarie
I mean, I
Robinson's
wonder about the
constantly
way
doing in the
Sartre read
footnotes.
it. Sartre read Heidegger in German in a POW camp. And he wouldn't have had any translations available. And was Sartre's German that good? One wonders what he got from it, and how that process worked in his mind. Um,
But Macquarie
Yes.
Robinson's constantly negotiating this everyday sense. That's why I said the everyday German reader, the mystical trans. But
yeah,
hey,
no,
and
they
our
do
version
mention
doesn't really work, but we're going to use it, fall prey to the tradition,
that. Yeah,
etc. So, huh.
it's true. And when they do have a footnote on that, it's usually very illuminating.
So we've attempted once again to finish section 6, I think,
I
in
do.
conclusion. Go ahead, Michael.
No, no, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we've attempted to finish section 6, and we really should, because the way it ends is to come back to Aristotle and the time problem. We got to really, historicality is announced, and then to destroy the tradition, but to come back to the time problem. Otherwise, we can't really get to the end of this introduction, where we get the whole schema, and it's meaning schema of the planned work that wasn't finished. And then for the Derrida part, we only did frighteningly so the first few paragraphs of a 20-page chapter, which I still believe is in the middle of the book. I don't know how many chapters there are. Is there 11 chapters, Paul? Or should you have something like that? And
2 or 3.
the fun stuff is, as they say, yet to come. And it is 11, yeah. So as far as I'm concerned, my dream fantasy is this one, which at least announces the problem of difference, gets us to what we might recognize as the current, what we know Derrida for, all the innovations.
Yeah.
So, in other words, we still have a long way to go. If it's helpful this time around, section 65 on ecstatic temporality. Chapter 3 is 10 pages long. I did this. Paragraphs 800 to 808 in Absolute Knowing, the last chapter, is also roughly 10 pages. I'm thinking to myself, wow, Heidegger in 1930-31 saying, I'm doing, being in terms of the mystery of time, the question of time without trying to even answer it. And you were trying to turn time into some kind of being and conceptualize it, Hegel. Both these two great Western thinkers collapse, so to speak, on the time question, not physical calculating time. They go back to Aristotle. Certainly the relationship of being and time, or the very substance of that relationship, which would be metaphysical for Hegel, something you destroy for Heidegger. But I think you should, even though we're not going to see this in the origin of geometry, if you want to get through that 65, that's where you get the mystery of ecstatic temporality. Because again, the deductions are being a Dasein in the world with others. That doesn't mean physically present or empirically present, not an individual subject, not Cartesian. The world is not physical or spatial. From that, you have to get to what it means to comport yourself and be thrown into it and anticipate possibilities. You can fall and be inauthentic. Okay, well, to get around that, you're going to come back to this care structure, which is not caring about things per se, but the whole stretch of life, and the concernfulness, solicitude, all that is going to take you back to, well, this is still not the more primordial way to get at what we're really sensing about our own finitude. Then you get to vision 2, death, resolve. The ecstatic time part is in this chapter 3, buried in this whole work. Lattner has this book on temporal idealism, which is supposed to be an interpretation of it, but he's doing it in terms of the Kant books. The Richardson, if you will, which is metaphysical and theological and religiously dense, kind of appropriation in that section 65, that ecstatic temporality, just like you saw in that historicality paragraph. I think because ecstasis, that's where it's introduced. Ecstasy in and outside of itself, which is what we fundamentally are, but in and for ourselves. Not because we're aging and flowing through time, but just our exposure and thrownness as the clearing of time itself. If I can be very abstract here for a second. He's trying to get at that, and then he doesn't say anything. He does in chapter 4, comes back to Kant in many respects. He's going to call it schemas of horizons by which all the three relate to each other, future, past, present, future, etc. That doesn't get to that level. These aren't raptures being taken away into the parts here, but witherings, which are flung in a certain direction. Past doing something to you through the present, future doing something to you through the present, past, etc. So time doesn't get developed, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
He goes back to saying, hey, chapter 6 is all about, you did this, Aristotle. Well, you're just saying time is a measurement of motion and computing and calculation. That's the problem. That's the inauthentic. Plato, you got your moving image of eternity. You're trying to metaphysicalize being. Augustine extended to the soul. Okay, well, that's the Christian problem, but And then Hegel, your spirit-time connection. You're. This is really radical. This is so beyond. And yet, you know what? I think you're presupposing this ordinary sense of time too, which is not really fair, but that's what he says. So section 65 is what I'm at the end. I think at some point, we're never going to finish being in time if we don't start reading at the end and bring in, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, it's been around fine for me. I don't.
It's the Derridean approach now, I guess, on being in time, which I value.
So for next week, what should we read?
Yeah, we skip around no matter what. It's just the way
Okay.
we live it.
So I'm going to
So
say
give us some chapters to read for next week.
Well, it's 7 has to continue. We just did the first 2 paragraphs. Spiritual corporeality, spatio-temporality, and location. We're moving into time deeply. So I thought, okay, if we're going to go with 7 and Derrida, section 65, chapter 3, division 2 is on ecstatic temporality as the basic structure of care. Care is being thrown, already in, past, being ahead of oneself, running ahead, anticipating, constantly worrying about what we're going to be or have to do, but that's the ontic sense, future, and alongside is with other things in the world being present. Those three intermingle in care. That's not deep enough for Heidegger. Let me take you to this ecstatic temporality, coming towards having been, making present. So section 65, chapter 3 is temporality. He keeps on doing this as the meaning of the being of care, which is the meaning of the being of Dasein. Temporality is the meaning of care, care is the meaning of Dasein, Dasein is what we are. So if you're doing that for the first time, this sounds very arrogant. There is no elaborate interpretation of section 65 on temporality by anyone in France, Germany, or England. There's 200 years of interpretation of Hegel, or at least 150 or 180, 30, sorry. Yeah, at least 70 or 80 years on absolute knowing, but also very little on the time question. Some, but as far as I can see. But definitely, I don't see any massive interpretation of this. And that's the linchpin of it all. All right. Well, thank you for the gathering. Wishing everybody the best. Can do 2 weeks. Is that okay? Another 2 weeks? All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Raj.
Thank you,
Alex,
Raj.
Alex,
Thank
nice
you.
shirt.
Thank you both.
Really,
Thank you,
really like
Michael.
your